Delaney, an NBC News justice correspondent. He has some breaking news. Ken, fill us in on even more breaking news that's happening in the last minute or so.
So, Katie, the Justice Department Special Counsel's Office has now issued the superseding indictment filed against now 3 defendants, Donald Trump, Walt Nauta, and Carlos de Oliveira. And these include 4 additional charges, and I'm going to read them to you. The superseding indictment adds a new count 32, charging Trump with 1 additional count of willful retention of national defense information. And then the superseding indictment also charges Trump, de Oliveira, and Nauta with 2 new obstruction counts based on allegations that the defendants attempted to delete surveillance footage at the Mar-a-Lago club in the summer of 2022. And finally, the superseding indictment charges de Oliveira with false statements and representations in a voluntary interview with the FBI on January 13th, 2023. So now we need to go into that indictment, which includes the narrative that was in the original indictment, and figure out exactly the facts related to these new charges. But again, Trump is charged in an obstruction of justice conspiracy with new counts of attempting to delete surveillance footage, which adds a deeply significant new dimension to these allegations. It makes it as much about obstruction of justice as it is about retaining classified information, Katie.
Yeah, and Ken, to your point, willful retention of NDI, there were multiple counts against Donald Trump in that original indictment against him. But the obstruction is what really stinks the most, right? That's the one that's going to be the most compelling arguments that are being made. The fact that the obstruction counts, that there's 2 of them, what does that say to you, especially because they add de Oliveira and include Nauta, who was a part of the obstruction in the original indictment?
Well, I think to your point, look, I've covered the intelligence community for more than a decade. Retaining classified information, especially at the level of classification that we're talking about here, is deeply significant. It is extraordinary that a former president did this. But a lot of regular Americans out there are saying when they hear about this, well, didn't Biden do that? Didn't Mike Pence do it? Of course, that's not the same, but that's what a lot of people are saying because they're not delving into the details. But the obstruction element of this case makes it different, and everyone can understand that. What the government is saying here is that Donald Trump, once he got caught taking these documents, did everything he could to stymie the federal government in their ability to investigate and get those documents back, up to and including, now they're saying, trying to delete surveillance footage. That is something that every regular American can understand. They know that's a crime. It's been charged all over the place in cases large and small, very significant. It's been charged against prominent people. It's been charged against regular people. So that's why I think this is very powerful. And they're saying it was a conspiracy involving Donald Trump and 2 of his lower-level employees who are now implicated and facing years in prison, again, according to the allegations in this indictment, because of things that Donald Trump wanted done. And I think that's going to send a powerful message. Again, the people are all presumed innocent. They'll have their defenses, but that's what the government is alleging here in these new allegations, Katie.
You know, Ken, we're getting the superseding indictment as it rolls in. I'm really intrigued also by the false statements count that de Oliveira is looking at, because that gives standalone exposure to de Oliveira, like it did to Walt Nauta, because Walt Nauta had that same charge in the original indictment. So de Oliveira has his own personal exposure, standing separate and apart because of what he said to the federal government when he was interviewed back in January, as you said, of this year. Has there been any indication whatsoever, Ken, in terms of whether or not de Oliveira has maybe participated in anything in terms of meeting with special counsel Jack Smith's team, more so than this interview that we're learning about from January of 2023?
Well, as you know, Katie, if he were a cooperator, they wouldn't be doing it this way. They wouldn't be filing a superseding indictment naming him as a defendant. They would file a criminal information. And so that's not what's happening. So my interpretation of that is he's not cooperating. And it's so tragic. He's facing years in prison, as is Walt Nauta. When you know, and I know, because we've covered, you've litigated these cases, I've covered them, they would be the first people that prosecutors would offer a deal to, because they are lower level people in the conspiracy who have a lot of information about the defendant that prosecutors are most interested in, which is former President Donald Trump. But for whatever reason, both of these gentlemen, as far as we know now, are remaining loyal to Trump. Mr. Nauta's lawyers are paid for out of Trump's political action committee. So, it's a they're in lockstep. They appear to be working very closely together and sharing information. And so As far as we can tell, Mr. De Oliveira is now in that same position. Now, will he continue to hold that position as he starts to come to grips with the seriousness of these charges and the prison terms that they carry? We'll have to see. But as of right now, that's where it stands, Katie.
Well, we haven't seen De Oliveira getting cheesesteaks with Donald Trump lately, so maybe De Oliveira will stand on his own. Ken Delaney, and thank you for bringing us up to date on this breaking news. We're going to go back now to Maya, Emily, Renato, and Nick. Renato, I got the superseding indictment in front of me. It's a doozy. The original indictment was a doozy, but we now just heard the breaking news from Ken Delaney and about these new additional charges. Donald Trump facing yet another count for willful retention of NDI, 2 new obstruction counts for deleting surveillance footage, and then De Oliveira on his own having that false statements charge. I mean, Renato, deletion of surveillance footage? I mean, how much more consciousness of guilt can you get from Donald Trump?
Yeah, well, and I think that's the key. You mentioned Donald Trump. I really think a lot of this is a way of sidestepping some of the key defenses and arguments that Trump is raising, right? So he keeps talking about the Presidential Records Act. There's this whole declassification nonsense. All of that gets pushed to the side when you're talking about deleting evidence, destroying evidence, lying to the FBI, et cetera, right? So this whole effort to hide things from the government really sidesteps all of that. It's the sort of thing that also, if you get a bad juror or two for the prosecution, very hard for them in the jury room to justify that to their fellow jurors. But I really think, one thing you focused on a moment ago, Katie, was this false statement charge to the FBI. It's important to understand the context of that. This is after the FBI raided Mar-a-Lago. This is after there's a criminal investigation. And I will just say, in my experience, the jurors have a lot of trouble excusing people or lying and trying to cover up activity after they know that there's a criminal investigation. It's just very hard to claim that you were focused on it or that you were mistaken because you know the stakes at that point.